that was a lot trippier than originally advertised. Cobra for this one featured a face-off between the Ojamajo plus Masharika against all of their respective fairy partners. The episode proper would basically explain how we got here as they showed the daily lives of the fairies. This includes some fun activities like taking messages by catching falling letters. No, I always wondered why it sounded like someone was in pain whenever I typed on this thing. Now let's see. Eggs, flower. Or looking up books that they could read to Hana, which of course the brat would be just as picky about them as her food. However, Dodo probably had to suffer through the worst feature on their little Temu Kindle tablet.
Well, that's just silly.
Like seriously, what exactly is the point of having a fortune-telling feature that also doubles as a torture device? Oh right, to help set up the main conflict of this episode. Yep, as the cold opener hinted, the fairies were considering revolting against their masters. Lala at first tried to talk him out of it, but they managed to win her over by telling her about how Masharika seemed to talk behind her back a lot. They didn't clarify whether or not they made some of the stuff up, but the episode also didn't deny it, so I guess it was true. Though, wouldn't it just be devious if these fairies were trying to goad Lala into joining their side? Not that it mattered much, as Masharika did end up insulting Lala when she didn't realize she was in ear range. Hey, come on, McDonald's has been trying to up their game lately. Maybe not successfully, but still. We'll say, these fairies are at least guilty of gaslighting with this final push here. With that, we got the plot of this episode that was likely pretty timely, as it aired during Japan's economic protests of the early 2000s over the rights of the part-time workers of the country, and yet it also became one of the more universal and timeless plots, especially nowadays, as the fairies went on strike. We're gonna join SAG-AFTRA! Well, that's not gonna lead anywhere. Shut up, believe in the process! But yeah, they basically took indefinite residence in the recipe book until their list of demands were met. This included the normal fare of many protests like public apologies, less work, and more rest. Honestly, these were mostly reasonable demands, but again, to make this episode timeless, the protesters started to overplay their hands. Okay, now this is starting to sound more like a government shutdown than just a little protest. Also, I don't think there's enough hard drives in the world to contain every episode of Detective Conan and One Piece. Though I will say, while the Ojamajo, especially Doremi, were being a little too demanding, I did end up siding with them after this little detail. We'll gladly let this toddler suffer through severe health conditions until our, how many did we have again? Yeah, that many. Okay, this is really starting to sound like real-life politics. Granted, they did dramatize the Hana situation too much, so it didn't bother me as much as I think it should have, though it also didn't make this the most compelling conflict either. Though I will say, I kind of like Masharika's gear here, which I think is based on the actual Japanese protester gear. If this were based on modern American protests, she would probably have to wear like a pink or blue or some kind of weirdly colored wig. Anyway, the Ojamajo decided that they at least need to lure out the fairies of their little autonomous zone and force them to actually negotiate things. I'll send in the National Guard. Actually, they sent a negotiator with Pop's fairy, Fafa. Oh yeah, that was a character, right? Yeah, she was. Well, again, it didn't really matter, as she was won over to side with her kin. Thus, it was up to Momoko to try her hand by using by far the most evil spell in her repertoire, becoming a hippie.
I'm so happy to be here! Love and peace!
Okay, but seriously, this is probably one of the weakest songs of this entire season, as it's not really all that catchy, and yeah, it's just hippie junk. I guess it's kind of funny in how lame it is, but it's still lame. That said, I guess the Pied Piper wasn't exactly the greatest artist himself, he just had to play the rats. Well, now we know how Fire Festival happened, in spite of the many red flags. However, a few slaps from Lala managed to wake up the fairies, so they moved on to the next plan. And sure enough, like most social movements, they turned to the celebrities, which always works out for the best, don't they? I mean, granted, I'd imagine Ompu would be a much better speaker than Rachel Ziegler, but still, who isn't? At first it seemed to work until Lala decided to test their honesty by having Doremi summon forth a big-ass steak and took it for themselves. Her resulting freakout ended up baiting out the other Ojamajo, exposing their nets and cages for the little bug ladies. This led to more of a screaming battle between the parties, which again is very accurate, but honestly, if I need this kind of entertainment, I would just watch the real thing, as at least that involves a lot more swearing. Granted, this debate did have one unique element in the form of a very hungry little witch. Yeah, what looks more terrifying to you, this or this? Either way, I'm gonna have night terrors for a while. Surprisingly though, this proved to be the most effective method of getting them out through the power of just sheer force. This led to a climax that was probably the best part of the episode, which yeah, has been kind of low bar throughout, but still, dumb fun is better than no fun at all, right? But yeah, it basically just became one big food fight with some hippie music and steak. Did Tsubumi get her catchphrase from the Toad? And one last time, I gotta praise them for being surprisingly accurate to real-life, mostly peaceful protests. Nice to know that things aren't too dissimilar around the world. However, their feud just kind of stopped after Hana started to cry and they decided to take care of her. Though, and also, Ompu tried to wrap up things nicely by saying that it was good that they fought each other, as eventually they will have to go their separate ways. And yeah, I have no idea why they think they can end a goofy episode like this on a somewhat touchy note. I'm just like, really? But yeah, this episode was just fine. I mean, it did have some good comedy, but otherwise, it was just kind of there. I will say, I do appreciate how, ironically, this episode feels rather timeless, which probably was the funniest aspect of it all. However, when I'm just not all that invested in the main conflict, well, then it just feels kind of sauceless. I think there really is a part of me that wants to like this episode a little more than I actually do. After all, it has the makings of a classic Ojamajo Doremi episode with wacky spellcasting nonsense, cute-ish interactions between the characters, and even some timeless commentary, though maybe a little bit more by accident with that last one. Yeah, much like how the Nostalgia Critic pointed out how the Simpsons Halloween segment spoofing the 1996 elections has somehow become rather timeless, this episode about a bunch of idiots protesting and their employers being stubborn asses does really show how little we've grown over the decades. Hell, just the bit where they make their demands feels like some more recent and maybe even ongoing events in the US. I record some of this stuff ahead of time, so I'm not sure what's going on right now. But whatever the case, with that mindset, this episode is actually a little funnier than it might have been intended to be. I also do kind of wish I was a little more invested in the actual plot, but it just kind of lacked that energy when everyone is just being portrayed as selfish or stupid. Sure, it can be funny at first, but after a while, it just feels like you're watching a bunch of jerks competing with who could be the bigger ass. Not to help when the resolution to this episode feels incredibly tacked on and rushed. Still, overall, I would actually say I liked this episode. It was just lacking that extra oomph to make it great for me. Still, at the very least, it was a little less cringy than actual political debates. A little. Thanks for watching, and if you want to avoid the mob yourself, well, I think our videos could help with that in some way. Got something new coming out almost every day, and sometimes early if I need to upload before I go on a vacation, per se. Still, look forward to whatever comes next, and until then though, for now my friends, and they're continuing with their demands. I'm gonna need some coffee for this.